The McAlvany Weekly Commentary covering monetary, economic, and geopolitical news events.
We've got a number of tender boxes, which are the setup for massive fiscal spending, which are the way of saving the system, but there has to be the cover. It is actually going to have to be front page news. Tragedy, chaos, loss, conflict, war, and then all of a sudden governments get to move from their monetary policy motif to their fiscal policy spend.
Now here are Kevin Orrick and David McAlvany.
Welcome to the McAlvany Weekly Commentary. I'm Kevin Orrick along with David McAlvany. David, a funny thing happened on the way to the bank Friday here in Durango. People couldn't get their money out. I'm talking Wells Fargo, Bank of Colorado, big names. People were just being turned away because the bank could not give them money.
Generally, when you see a line out the front of a bank, you think, we need to figure out what's going on and maybe even get in that line. We don't want to be at the very end, but if it keeps on growing, maybe we'll be somewhere in the middle. And of course, we've had recent lines out the banks in Cyprus and Greece and other places where you understand that there's solvency and credit quality issues where the banks literally don't have the money to pay.
But in this particular case, it had nothing to do with the solvency of the bank. It had to do with the internet processing that would allow them to actually verify that you were a client or not.
So we're dealing with an issue of technological dependency, where if you wanted to withdraw funds from a bank and there was something wrong with the internet service provider, lo and behold, because banking is now all digitally based, there is no way to confirm that you even have money on account with that institution. Doesn't matter if you show up with an end-of-month statement. Doesn't matter if you just 5 minutes ago deposited $50,000, $2,000, $5. It doesn't matter. They don't have a digital way of saying, yes, this is the person, this is their account, this is their current balance, and they can withdraw funds.
Well, and it wasn't just the banks. Here's the irony of it. My son went to a movie with another friend of his on Friday night, and he came back and he said, CenturyLink is down, which is the provider that went down. There was a line that had been cut in a nearby town. And all the movie theater was accepting was cash. They turned away anyone who had a credit card. So let's say you can't get cash out of your bank and you want to function. Okay, so you don't have cash. All right, well, what we'll do is we'll just go ahead and use our credit cards. No, it doesn't work that way because those businesses were only accepting cash. Now, this is right here in our little 15,000 person town of Durango.
Ordinarily, when we think of a bank and a problem that you might have with it, we're thinking, okay, well, are they C-rated, D-rated, F-rated? I mean, where literally they've made so many bad loans that they are going to be taken over.
And it's worth knowing that information.
It's absolutely worth knowing where your risk lies. But in this case, we're dealing with two institutions, and my assumption is that, we don't have direct experience with every bank in our area, but with these two institutions, you're talking about C or better rated banks, and that wasn't the issue. The issue was technological dependency. The issue is there's no way to do banking without the computers on. And that's an interesting thing to consider because there's other areas in our life where we have high levels of technological dependency. If I want to talk to my father and mother in the Philippines, if I want to talk to my brother in Indonesia, if I want to talk to my sister in Tennessee, if I want to talk to anybody in my family, I don't know their numbers anymore. Do you know why? It's stored in my smartphone, and all I have to do is pick it up and dial. But it means that communication, something that you think, is fairly basic, it's really not that basic. And it is dependent on a number of things working and working very well. Gone are the days of rotary phones and a phone book that you keep all of those numbers recorded. Nothing's recorded. I actually, outside of my laptop and my smartphone, I don't have phone records for anyone or anything.
Well, and think about it. How many people still have? Now, I still have a landline, but my wife and I have discussed, is this really worthwhile? And very few people actually still have landlines. Now, something you said in a meeting just a few minutes ago, Dave, before we came into the studio, to all of us, and it's true, as a company for the last 40 some odd years, we've tried to ask people to be early and to prepare rather than stand in line. And this is what you said. You said one reason we ask you to be early is that we know what it looks like to stand in line. Now, there were lines on Friday, and of course, the issue got resolved. But what really does it look like when you have a national incident like an EMP go off, or you have a solar flare, or you have, let's just say, just like the SWIFT system, the international transaction system got hacked recently, and Janet Yellen was talking about it. What happens when you cannot access what it is that you function with?
Well, and from a sociological standpoint, I mean, what we're talking about is avoiding conflict areas. We travel enough to have missed flights or have had flights canceled and have been forced into long lines where everyone has to be rebooked. And as long as there's a solution, there's usually relative calm in a long line of 50 or 100 people.
Right.
But if there is no solution and nothing can be done, people get angry. And I've watched it. I've watched people in line trying to get home for the holidays or trying to get to a business meeting where a major deal needs to be signed or an agreement needs to come together. And the temperature rises.
Well, they go into fight or flight, which is that emotional state that actually helps us in the right situations, but it becomes very, very dangerous in that kind of situation.
So it's interesting to me that very few people actually have something as basic as a gallon of water and a space blanket in the back of their car.
Or a little bit of cash in a box.
Or a little bit of cash in a box in their home. Yeah. Or a few cans of soup extra, more than they need. Because, the reality is we live in the four corners of Colorado, and we've got two highways that come in. And if something were to happen with the normal supply lines where produce and groceries, which are coming from Denver or Albuquerque, can't get here, well, we assume that there's a solution within 24 to 48 hours.
Right.
What if it's 72 hours? What if it's a week?
Are you just working yourself up? Are you talking like a prepper here, Dave?
Well, it's interesting that you go to the bank on a Friday and you say, well, I need a couple $100 for the weekend, cash, to do this and that. And they say no. And you think, well, I wasn't expecting that. Mm-hmm. Is there something wrong with the bank? No, there's nothing wrong with the bank. But there is something wrong with the system when you have high levels of dependency and there's nothing that you can do to sort of work around it. And so the solution to this theoretical problem is deal with it ahead of time.
Right. You mentioned this in the meeting, too. Independence is an important thing. You can't be completely independent in life, and to think that you're ever going to be completely self-sufficient is ridiculous. But you can have a degree of independence and not have to answer to whoever's giving out the solution at the end of that line.
We watched the crisis in Greece unfold. And as folks who are in the gold business, one of the things that we noticed is that all of the supplies of British sovereigns, which we normally source from Europe, they disappeared from Europe and they were all funneling to Greece. Why? Because it's a small fractional gold coin. And in the context of the banking crisis, they went to a particular coin which they were familiar with, minted on 5 continents. It was compelling to them. It was something that they had seen. They had known it through World War II and many decades of just being around, right? So it was in the context of crisis that people said, well, we got to have something other than euros or exposure to our banking system because it may get taken from us. We don't know what we're going to end up with.
Well, on a larger scale, we're sort of seeing this move towards independence occurring worldwide. I mean, look at this week, the vote on Brexit. Okay, we've got a empire, what was an empire in the British Empire, that is saying, maybe we don't want to be submissive to a legal system or a system that would take away our independence when we need it the most.
Right. Well, it's probably the most important vote of 2016. And I think I can legitimately say that. Yes, we've got a vote in November here in the United States. And yes, it's important. But in terms of something that has ramifications for the whole world, I think this is maybe the vote heard around the world.
Right.
And it may come to nothing this week, but under review is the involvement that Britain has had with the European Union, which they formalized in 1972, so 43 years ago. And this is where you find that a particular perspective on an issue means everything. Right. So you've got those who are proposing leaving this close tie to the EU, leaving it behind. And there is a deep sense that British national pride is a part of that, prioritizing Britain.
And that's beyond patriotic pride. I mean, we're not talking about redneck runaway. What we're talking about is people looking at the last 1,000 years in a nation that has established what we know as Western law and ultimately even our own Constitution here in America.
Well, and to just add to that, yes, there is a degree of patriotic zeal, but it goes beyond that. There is an appreciation of the difference in the way laws were written in continental Europe versus those laws written and determined by the history which came from the Magna Carta. So beyond patriotic zeal is the gradual usurpation of the judicial and parliamentary system in Britain. And that usurpation is by the European Court of Justice. You're talking about a Brussels organization stepping in. And from the exit perspective, if you will, this is where the real danger has lurked. Simply by treaty. By treaty, the ECJ, or the European Court of Justice, has gained this strange cross-border role. And that cross-border role subjugates British judges to a lower rank beneath the intranational body, that is the ECJ. And they're basically claiming jurisdiction. The Brussels body is claiming jurisdiction over areas that really should be the domain of domestic and national interest alone.
Well, let's just look at this from an American perspective. Let's say, now I know from a Constitution basis that I know I have certain rights that are protected by a U.S. Constitution. Now, let's say there was an international body that told me I didn't have those same rights. At that point, I would say, you know what? I want the Americans out of that. I want the United States to vote, get out of whatever that organization is.
Right. Well, in the past, the U.S. has gone down a similar path where international and maritime treaties have obligated us to rules which were never put through the legislative gauntlet. But there is a liability created if we don't comply. So we now, as U.S. citizens, have to comply with these international treaties. And again, it's not the legislators who have made these rules which we have to comply to. Again, there's different ways of looking at the issue in Britain, but in Britain, the folks that want to stay, they want to stay deeply embedded in the EU or the economic project, and they're willing to overlook this political issue, the judicial and parliamentary concessions which have been made. Quite frankly, because the arrangement has been lucrative.
Well, and look at who's really the proponent of staying in the EU. You and I both received The Economist magazine, which is an establishment magazine out of London. And the cover this week basically says, "Divided we fall." In other words, I got several texts. I don't know if you got them too this weekend. Early reports that were coming out trying to influence the decision of the British people. This is not a publication that's saying, we're going to cover both sides fair and justly. It's saying, look, the establishment wants to stay in the EU.
I was very fascinated. Tragically, the assassination of the MP, which occurred a week or so ago, tragic that occurred, but I was fascinated by how quickly the momentum turned from pro-exit to pro-stay with the status quo.
Right. It was almost instantaneously. The British pound surged, the gold price dropped. It was almost as if somebody was doing something to the market to influence the way people looked at the situation.
And the rhetoric that was almost prepackaged and so readily available in the news reports. I mean, literally within minutes of the assassination, it to me suggests that the establishment is very concerned about losing grip.
Well, and there's a tremendous amount of wealth that's been created by this union with the Europeans.
And arguably, wealth would be destroyed if the Brits walked to the exits. London would lose a lot of international prestige, and you would see flight capital. So the pound sterling, there's no question it would be devalued, not unlike what we saw in the last 6 or 7 years. There was another pound sterling devaluation in the 90s, and then, of course, in the 30s as well. And in each case, the devaluation was bad for the financial sector, but very good for the export sector. They didn't mind at all. So, again, it suggests that the base level contentions between those who want to remain and those who want to leave, it may simply boil down to sort of an atavistic self-interest. And so beyond the rhetoric, it's always important with both sides in the argument to ask who directly benefits monetarily.
Well, and one of the guests that we have on a regular basis, Ambrose Evans-Pritchard, was part of this whole European project. He spent 5 years in Brussels, Belgium, while they were putting the euro together. And he wrote a very interesting piece in the London Telegraph a few days ago saying, as painful as this is, and as much as this is going to cost, I'm voting that we go out because it's worth the cost. And, I was out running this morning, Dave, and I thought, not to sound quippy, but it's more you Brexit, you bought it. And so basically there is going to be a cost. Okay. If they do exit, there will be a financial cost. But, look at the price that was paid for freedom and for independence in the past in this country, and even going back to early England.
Well, and you certainly see some parallels in terms of having an external body who is calling shots far, far away from the people who are interested in what is happening, with the business right under their noses. King George certainly wanted to tell us what when and how to do what we were going to do in the colonies. And the colonies said, that's fine, as long as we're well represented. And we didn't have the representation. So without the representation, we felt it necessary to flex our political muscle. You look at the Scottish initiative sometime back, and they did not go the route of independence, in part because of the scaremongering which occurred, which was very effective in creating this sense of we can't calculate the losses. We don't know. And I think in part they didn't want to know, because if you could calculate it, then you're making a decision based on fact. And it's easier to create a context of fear wherein people just say, we'll deal with the status quo, the devil we know, rather than the devil we don't know.
Right. And as sad as that murder was last week, that seems to be what the emotional shift changed, was the fear of possibly being tied to something that looked radical.
Well, and maybe the debate is, in fact, more than who gets what. As this plays itself out, this may be a very fascinating test case for whether that issue of the threat of financial loss or economic chaos, if that's sufficient to hold voters to one side, or do the British wish to pay that price in order to maintain the ties to a legal tradition dating back to the Magna Carta? And, what allowed them to become a great power? What allowed them to become a great power? You could, in large part, say the British legal tradition set them on a trajectory, and there were a number of technological innovations along the way that supported what was an idea and a radical departure from what had been common to the world and certainly continental Europe. And that, to me, is, I think, what is sort of a subtext here.
Well, and Dave, the first time my daughter and I went to London, I told her, I said, there's only a couple of things I really need to see. And the British Library, I wanted to see the several copies of the Magna Carta that were there, because talking about a price to pay, up to that point, there was sort of that European feel, the French feel. I hate to say it, but it was the French, European, continental feel of law where royalty had all the rights and the people did not. Now, the Magna Carta, there was a price to pay. Even with the royalty and the wealthy at the time, that was a defining document that began giving the people the rights that they actually were given by God.
Yeah, you go to London, and visiting Churchill's war rooms is a must. Going to the Imperial War Museum is a must. Going to the British Library is a must. And going to the British Museum, the British Museum used to have the Rosetta Stone, and the Rosetta Stone was not behind glass when I was there in the 90s. And for those of you with a curatorial inkling, this will, I'm sure, shock and horrify you. But just behind this red sash was the Rosetta Stone, and I felt compelled to touch the Rosetta Stone. And 1,000 years from now, probably the oils on my hands will have destroyed one of the most important archaeological pieces in the British Museum. But now it's behind glass and you can't touch it. I would like to think that I'm not the primary cause of that, but you have to go to these places, and you have to go to the British Library, and you have to see the document which not only set in motion the way that Britain does law, but the way we do law, because we borrowed all the best ideas from the British in that respect.
But it takes a perspective that goes before 1972. 1972, you brought up, was when we started to see more of a unified Europe, which we talked to Otmar Issing about, and there's nothing wrong with a more unified Europe, but it's very, very difficult to accomplish and still maintain an independent nation like Britain.
Right. So with the whole issue of Brexit, it is that some Brits think that the greatness of Britain predated 1972, and some see it now as dependent on being tied to Europe, which, again, that dependency ratcheted up with intensity starting in 1972, and then subsequently they became even closer via the Treaty of Lisbon. And how close? Sort of in your knickers close. I mean, you wouldn't believe how involved Europe is in the minutia of what happens in the UK. And it was Ambrose Evans Pritchard who has argued this stark contrast between the Napoleonic legal tradition of the continent, which the ECJ, the European Court of Justice, is in tune with, and the British Code, which is based on the Magna Carta. And it's the latter which has encouraged far more enterprise, and it's the former which has created far more bureaucratic red tape, as long as it's been around.
Well, and when we talked to Otmar Issing, who, for those who recall, was the head of the European Central Bank for 7 years, he was one of the originators of the thought process of the euro as a currency. He had an honest desire to see Europe and that region never go to war again, because he had remembered the wars that had destroyed Europe up to that point. So there are some very good reasons why there should be unity. But what's interesting is people are willing to give up almost anything when times are good. When the credit cycle's moving, you can borrow money. It's like, yeah, the European Union, it's not that big a deal. But that credit cycle, Dave, is tightening, and people's money belts are tightening. And now they're starting to look at things that they hadn't looked at before in a different light.
Now, I love the guys that study socioeconomics and sort of social trends and what those social trends tell you about the markets and what is taking place in an economy. Now, to me, Brexit is indicative of the thought process, perhaps the regrets, which go along with the end of a credit cycle. And as a credit cycle accelerates, as you said, there's the hallmarks of cooperation, there's trade agreements, there's sort of the generous cross-border integration. But then you get to the end of a credit cycle and sentiment changes radically.
Yeah.
You have arguably a larger force than central banks can manage. That is, as a credit cycle begins to unwind. And you see the opposite of those qualities. You see disintegration. You see the prioritization of national interests. You see a return to viewing the global economy as a pie which is only finitely divisible. And so a grand supercycle ends when self-interest, when national interests are no longer cloaked and partnerships convert to competition, when you have outright conflict.
Well, and sometimes you look at the European Union and you think it's everyone equal. But if you really look at it, Germany has been the financial backbone of the European Union. Now, they have very, very high stakes on this vote that occurs on Thursday.
Well, sure, because it's the German banks which have huge exposure, direct exposure, indirect exposure via their derivatives books. And, that's the part that is sort of below the waterline, so to say, their derivative exposure. You know that they have a good amount, and you can watch the share prices of both your German and Swiss banks. But your German banks, you've got Deutsche Bank trading at levels it hasn't been at since 1992, where there is pressure. There is a lot of pressure and a lot of assumptions that if Brexit goes through, you're going to see a breaking in the financial markets in Europe. So yes, the ties are there. Brexit would no doubt topple the share price of the German financial players even more than it has already. And yes, it could threaten insolvency, which quite frankly already pre-exists. It's just in a managed state. So this week, at least through Thursday, this is the most active which central bankers have been behind closed doors since the global financial crisis. And so you've got liquidity deals which are being penned. You've got emergency supplies of euros and dollars, credit, that is, which is already being arranged.
Right. And, here's the thing. If it goes either way, it doesn't necessarily bring peace. If Britain stays in the euro, financially, there's still a lot of costs that have been outlaid.
Well, that's right. And to a degree, you've got all of the hedges, you've got the protections put in place to protect from the financial ramifications of leaving the EU. And those would be quickly unwound, which is, again, if you've been covered, fine. But there's always two sides to a bet, right? And so someone is going to experience pain either way, Brexit or no Brexit. It was Bloomberg that was noting on the 16th of June that money market funds in Europe are already flashing quote unquote warning signals as the rising credit risk is being spurred in part by fears of the Brexit, and it's making it harder for big banks to obtain U.S. dollar funding. So, as you might guess, just as we saw in 2008 and 2009, and then again in 2011 and 12 when it began to really intensify in Europe, the Fed opened up its swap lines and were able to wheel and deal overnight and create liquidity in Europe. And my guess is the swap lines are open. The question is, will liquidity be sufficient to avoid a replay of 08 and 09 in its entirety in terms of the step sequence of liquidity translating into ultimately a solvency crisis?
Well, and don't you think, Dave, oftentimes when you see a major political paradigm shift like what we're possibly looking at, it almost always boils down to the elite, the people who are well embedded in the current system, being out of touch with the rest of the people.
Well, it is. And I think you create that sense of elite. Citigroup research analyst, a guy by the name of Gregory Marks, had an interesting commentary this last week. He basically asked if negative rates have allowed, because of sort of an intellectual free pass. Again, there's monetary elites, there's the folks who are, from their balance sheet perspective, perhaps considered elites, but then there's the intellectual elite too, the ivory tower, white glove crowd who doesn't really like to get dirty because their ideas are so pristine. And he's asking the question, Gregory Marx is at Citigroup, are these folks smart people? Are they being allowed to work under false assumptions because they're smart? Are central bankers doing the same thing as Rudolf Havenstein, which is a familiar name to our regular commentary listeners, doing the same thing that he did in Germany in the 1920s?
Right. Well, he was given a pass because he was considered so intellectually above the central banking community at the time.
Well, and this is where intellectual conceit is a very, very dangerous thing. He's asking if negative rates are not the modern version of Havenstein's misguided and intellectually blinded approach. Where we've put something in motion, and yet we have this strange dependency on the elites in our culture. And yet there is this growing sense that we can't stand it either, because there is, no, we don't know what we don't know. On the other hand, common sense would tell you there's certain things that you just do know, and you don't have to go with the most complicated, complex solution. Sometimes the most elegant solution is the simplest.
The central bankers seem to be telling us that the whippings will continue until your attitude improves. And I'm speaking of negative interest rates at this point. The intellectuals are saying, you know what? If they're not spending money, we'll just whip them some more.
Well, so that's Gregory Marx asking the question. And I want to quote from a Fed official to answer that question in the affirmative. You have Federal Reserve Daniel Tarullo, who heads the Committee on Bank Supervision. He says this last week. Has what we've done been effective? If we say no, then maybe we need to return and do more. And intellectually, I am totally open to that.
Well, there you go.
It is. It's Havenstein, 2016, Exhibit A. And Gregory Marx goes on to say that the lesson here is that, unfortunately, people believed in the efficacy of a completely irrational policy because it was put in place by a qualified and experienced policymaker instead of questioning the common sense merits of its possible outcome.
Well, and it reminds me of Nero fiddling while Rome burned. Now, Rome seems to be burning. This central bank held together policy is not working. Yet what we're seeing in the East is a little bit different. What had been dollar dependency, and what that basically says is not just dollar dependency, but central bank dependency, reserve currency status of the dollar dependency.
Trade with the West dependency. Now what we're seeing is China go, I don't think we want to be dependent anymore. Maybe there's another ally that might cinch up a little bit more power without the West being in the picture. Now, it's interesting because Russia has made huge overtures, and China's very responsive. And it's trade cooperation deals, which they're moving forward with in a big way. I mean, they've got some big deals on the table, $6.2 billion high-speed rail deal. If you remember, things like roads and rails, and when you open up trade routes,
right,
it does something to open up cultures one to another.
Well, even the Silk Road, 1,000, 1,200 years ago, it changed the whole landscape.
You shared goods, you also shared ideas, and ultimately some cultural norms began to shift as those cultures moved towards each other. You, to some degree, had that with France and the UK when the Channel was put in, where there was a more interesting cooperative perspective between two countries that for centuries have really not enjoyed each other. So this joint transportation project, $6.2 billion high-speed rail, it'll be interesting to see how that developed. And you've got 30 different trade deals which are being discussed between Russia and China. And on top of that, Putin is now searching for a strategic partnership in Rosneft. That's the state-dominated oil and gas producer.
They're bigger than Exxon, aren't they?
They produce more energy resources, oil and natural gas, than ExxonMobil. And they'd like to, that is, Putin would like to have some sort of a deal with India and with China and swap a 19.5% stake for about $11 billion. That'll help them pay off some debt. But more importantly, it creates this allegiance which we're watching disintegrate in Europe, where Ottmar Issing wanted to create so much ties that bind, so to say, economically, and they are slowly becoming unhinged because there's other things that were never conceded or now being questioned as concessions not legal, that you've got in another sphere geographically the same kinds of ties being put into place.
Well, and now we're starting to see some geopolitical tensions forming as well. I mean, we're not just talking about monetary, financial, or oil types of connections, or even high-speed trains.
No, it makes me think about the Scarborough Shoal and the tensions in the South China Sea, if in fact we are now at the end of a period of Chinese glasnost. And that's a concept maybe that our listeners aren't familiar with, but if you look at contemporary Russian history during the Cold War, 1917 to say the late 80s, you have this continual opening up. Reforms, we want to change, we want to cooperate, we think we can do things different. Glasnost, perestroika.
Usually it relieved financial tension and military tension long enough for the West to just go ahead and feed some money into the region, and then they would tighten up.
Well, that's right. And it was fascinating. As I was reading the Financial Times, June 14th, they were discussing how the Chinese Communist Party is tightening control over the state-owned enterprises. And in terms of their management profiles, instead of being board-controlled, kind of following a U.S. or European model, they're going back to having a committee, part of the Communist Party, committee embedded in the state-owned enterprises who have to approve any strategic choices that are being made by the SOEs.
That sounds like a return to Mao.
Well, exactly. So you've got a tightening of control over state-owned enterprises. They are tightening control over the media, no surprise there, over the military, as they're kicking out the generals who wouldn't necessarily comply and are starting to think in more innovative fashion. And now you also have the civil society more broadly, which is being, sort of tightened down on. And it's Xi Jinping who is consolidating power and moving back to, if you want to call it, the Mao management model. They're moving away from the Chinese capitalist experiment of the last 2 decades. And it reminds me of one of those frequent openings in the Soviet Union. It allowed for an influx of foreign capital, glasnost and perestroika, the promise of change. Everyone could get stars in their eyes and say, look, it's a new era. We will create wealth and cooperation, and we don't have to worry about the bear anymore. And then there was that subsequent return to hardline communism after foreign funds had been captured. Well, look, you've got the tensions in the South China Sea, which may very well propel us backwards and reinforce that issue of the Mao management model. So right now, we've got the UN tribunal, which is hearing the Filipino case against the Chinese, and they're close. They're very close to determining which of the maritime disputes they have jurisdiction over. To me, that sounds just absolutely bizarre anyways. How does the UN and the Hague Convention have anything to do with what's happening in the South China Sea? But lo and behold, there's treaties that have been signed. And enough people have signed on the dotted line that we are talking about, does the UN have jurisdiction on this issue in the China Sea?
Well, and do you really feel like if the UN goes against anything that China's doing, that the Chinese are going to pay any attention to it?
No, the Chinese will reject a negative ruling, and I think they'll become more aggressive in asserting their 9-dash line. I looked at this with my wife here this week. You look at a map of the South China Sea and look where the Chinese have put their 9-dash line, and they're claiming water which is within spitting distance of the shores of Vietnam, Malaysia, Indonesia, the Philippines, Japan, and you look at how far it is from the coastline of Japan, and it is absolutely patently absurd. So what will we see? You're going to see us, the U.S., respond indirectly. I mean, how does the ball bounce from here? If the UN favors the Philippines in this case, then you have a hardline response, and it goes back to this Scarborough Shoal. The Scarborough Shoal is what we've defined as our red line in the South China Sea, where we will take action. Well, will we take action? Do we have the guts to take action?
Well, and by whose authority? Who is we these days?
Well, the U.S. I'm speaking specifically about the U.S. So what it will probably look like is the U.S. responding indirectly, supporting the Japanese, the Vietnamese, the Malaysians, the Indonesians, the Filipinos, supporting them via arms deals. And of course, all kinds of hackles will be raised because of that. And what is this doing? It is, back to the trade agreements and the closer ties between China and Russia. We are pushing the Chinese and the Russians together because on one flank, we have, all of these sanctions against Russia. On the other flank, we are pressuring China, right? And saying, basically, we're going to tell you what to do in your own backyard. Now, arguably, again, I don't know that we are the arbiter, but you look at the map, and it's really not their backyard. It's not their backyard at all. And yet we are the world's policemen because we're the ones with the biggest tanks, bombs, guns, the largest navy, et cetera, et cetera. So that's why we're inserted in someone else's backyard and their business.
Well, and I hate to sound conspiratorial, but your dad handed me a book written by a Russian defector who was part of a 50-year plan think tank. His name was Anatoly Golitsyn back in the 1980s. It's called New Lies for Old. And now, Let's put this in context for a moment, because I know this was a defining moment for you when the Berlin Wall came down.
That was high school reading for me and dinner table conversation leading up to the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, a very defining moment in my life.
And it was in the plan. It was in the 50-year plan, because Anatoly Golitsyn said, I read the book in 1988. You probably read it about the same time. That was years before the Berlin Wall fell. But in all of our minds, that was an impossibility for the Berlin Wall to come down. But there was something else he talked about. He said, over this 50-year plan, the strength of Russia and the strength of China will start to grow together. And he called it the pincer move. And he said from the Russian 50-year plan, it was always part of the plan. Russia wanted to make sure up to that point that the United States always armed itself only to the degree that Russia had armed itself. But they didn't want them to look at the two as a possible ally. And now that's what we're seeing, whether it was part of the plan or not. And you're saying maybe it's being caused by the end of this credit cycle, that these things were inevitable as things tightened up.
Well, like the Brexit vote, I mean, these are indicators. They're signs of the end of a grand super cycle. You've got the credit cycle, which is cooked, and there will be hell to pay. And the Chinese have just completed the world's fastest supercomputer using only Chinese components. Right. You've got nationalist pride, which only needs to be fed by a sense that the country is being attacked by outsiders. And what will you have in the wake of that? The quote-unquote next great leap forward, which again will be positioned as something that is being undermined by the U.S. and its proxies. And this is the makings of global conflict. Yes, the financial is tied to the economic to the political to the geopolitical. And we're now dealing with basic human insecurities. We're scratching deep. And we're going to find that when you scratch deep enough, you have transitioned, knowing or not knowingly, into a world of tooth and claw.
Yes, but there would be some people who would look at you, Dave, in their high-minded way and say, yes, but Janet Yellen has got this, and Bullard, and some of these other top-notch Federal Reserve people, they will provide the peace that they've promised.
Well, and this is, I think, a very fascinating thing, because you're dealing with the common man who is looking and saying, look, the master plans of the last 50 years, what have they amounted to? Yeah, they helped for a while, but what are they doing for me now? And no, people don't have a very long attention span. So what's happened in the last 6, 12, 18, 24 months is an eternity. And so the common man would say, look, I'm still fearing unemployment and I'm concerned. I just don't see it. It's the common man everywhere. Right. It is the common man in France. It is the common man in Italy. It is the common man in Greece. It is the common man in Britain. It is the common man in the U.S. So sure, you've got a Bullard, and he does a mega flop in the last week, going from hawk to uberdove, where essentially he says, yes, we're going to tighten monetary policy. We're going to raise rates. This is what we're going to do. This is our path forward. And then this last week, he converts to being actually the biggest dove on the FOMC committee. Financial Times on June 17th described, when they were looking at the dot plot, which is kind of the visual layout of who is likely to vote what out of the FOMC members. And there's this singular dot, which is set apart from everyone else, which marks the most distinct uberdove position. And it turns out that it's Bullard. We'll have one hike, and that'll be it until the end of 2018. One of two options exist for why rates are not on the rise after all the verbal commitments which have been flowing freely from the Fed. There's only two options here. One is that there is terror in the hearts of the Fed members over the general malaise in the global economy. And they look at things like what is happening in terms of international tensions, and they say, we can't add any pressure here. We can't add any pressure here. They look at the South Korean Central Bank just in the last couple of weeks, lowering rates, citing weakness in global trade. And they say, okay, we've just got to be on hold. Or this is the other option. Or perhaps the issue is the alternative set of Fed data points, right, the internal data points, and not the ones that are so frequently trotted out by the financial news media, suggest to the Fed that all is not well here in the U.S. as well as in Europe.
Well, and look at employment. I mean, we keep being told that employment's getting better and better and better, but actually that's not the case.
Well, again, it depends on your measure. So what is trotted out as the improved number is U3. So if you sit between 4.5% and 5%, things have gotten significantly better. But the labor market conditions index, the LMCI, which is the internal measure of the labor markets and employment that the Fed has created, and they created it in 2012 in large part because they didn't like U3 and U6. It didn't tell them what they needed to know.
Right.
It's declined 6 months in a row, Kevin. The LMCI is down 6 months in a row. And so, yes, you've got the public good news, which you can share. Hoorah, U3 is down to 4.7%. But the LMCI registers a 6-month negative reading. And this is a problem. This is a real problem.
So pay no attention to the LMCI behind the curtain. You know, they pulled it out when it worked, and now they put it back behind.
Right. So that leaves them with the sense that maybe they're stepping into a 1937 bear trap, where the economy is not strong enough to support tightening. And in 1937, that's when the Fed raised rates in an environment where it was not robust. The economy was not robust enough to handle tighter monetary policy. And the Great Depression aftershock was what followed. And it was only resolved by an increase in government spending, justified by entry into World War II. So pray we don't go down either the path of raising rates at the wrong time or spending when the public feels compelled to. And by the way, that is when politicians have natural cover to do so, when there is so much fear and a nation is responding to international conflict or war that the government has carte blanche to spend. The fiscal policies, there's no such thing as constraint. Fiscally, you can spend whatever you want. So to me, you look at the South China Sea, you look at the Middle East, and we've got a number of tender boxes which are the setup for massive fiscal spending, which are the way of saving the system, but there has to be the cover. And this is actually what keeps me up at night, thinking that it is actually going to have to be front page news, tragedy, chaos, loss, conflict, war, and then all of a sudden governments get to move from their monetary policy motif to their fiscal policy spend.
Well, and as we found through the years, just because you can say, see, I told you so, and you're right, there's no pleasure in that. I think of the commentary that we were doing back in December when we were talking about the expert consensus of economists saying that we were going to have 4 interest rate increases here in 2016. Now, you immediately said, no, there probably won't even be any.
It's
Bill
not
King
possible.
said something like that, too. He said, no, just give that one up.
That's patently absurd. Well, we got the one, but I'm reminded of what my dad used to say, and this is kind of an adage I grew up with. The majority are always wrong.
Right.
And so the majority of economists said, look, we're going to raise rates. The economy's okay. It's on the mend. So they thought. And you've got the data-dependent Fed, which has hit its targets. Why aren't they raising rates? Yet it didn't happen as it was anticipated, or it hasn't yet anyways. And we've just had the June meeting. And instead of non-hike in the rates driving stock prices higher, what did it do?
Right.
It brought them lower.
That was a completely different reaction.
Gold rose.
Yeah.
And it says to me that the currents are shifting. It says to me that there is some subtlety in the markets today, which is going to be high drama tomorrow.
Very different than the consensus in December on The Economist. The Wall Street Journal just said this week that the closely watched indicators are sour right now as economists are scrambling to assess risk.
Yeah, they said that hiring is slowing, auto sales are slipping, business investment is dropping, America's factories remain weak, and corporate profits are now under pressure.
Well, and Dave, you know, this is the thing that you've talked about so often, and it's discouraging because the numbers that we get from the government, they're always revising and changing. But the news that came out just the last couple of days that GDP is going to be reduced for the Obama administration tenure, which is 2008 until now, they're going to knock 2% total off the GDP.
Right.
That's phenomenal.
Well, and he was already averaging 1.55%. So it was already at the low ebb. If you're looking at GDP measures, he's the 4th lowest out of 43 presidents in U.S. history.
Right. They were other Depression presidents, weren't they, like Hoover?
Well, that's right.
Yeah.
That's right. So he's at the low end. And he's about to be taken down a notch in terms of, you know, what was accomplished. But it also, what the Commerce Department is basically saying, whether they know it or not, is that what we had been talking about recovery, what the news pundits had been talking about recovery, was weaker still than had been discussed over the last 3, 5, 7 years.
Right. But we're only being told at the end of the tenure.
So a market practitioner would say this, look, if you're going to see a major increase in economic activity, if you're going to see a rebound in equities, a major leg forward, where you're going to see the greatest improvement in terms of wealth generation is within the financial sector.
Right.
They have leverage to any real growth. And so you will generally see financials lead on the upside. You'll also see financials lead on the downside. And so you look at European banks, they're trading at the lowest level since the worst part of the European crisis in 2011 and 2012. Does that suggest that Europe is out of the woods? No, quite the opposite. It suggests they have another round of decline ahead. We've got growth here in the United States, which stalled in mid-2015, and prices have been in decline ever since in the U.S. financial sector and in the U.S. banks. So you've got this year's year-to-date performance going back to Europe. It's the worst, of course, in Italy. Bank shares are down 44% on average. Deutsche Bank, gosh, wouldn't you like to know what's going on behind the scenes at Deutsche Bank? They're trading at levels they haven't seen, as I mentioned earlier, since 1992. Credit Suisse down 48% since the beginning of the year. This is across Europe, and it is extending across the Atlantic to the U.S. financials.
Well, and this is what happened in 2008 before the crisis, is it not? I mean, that was the late, not so great 2008, but we're now probably going to have to come up with a rhyme for 2017.
Right. The distinction amongst the financial players, there are weaker players. And you're seeing stock charts which would suggest that there are some who have far more leverage, who have far more toxic derivative exposure, whose loan books have already soured or are rotten to the core. And so those are the ones that stand out like a sore thumb. So maybe that's Credit Suisse. Maybe that's Deutsche Bank. Maybe here in the U.S., we could pick a few to pick on. In Italy, it's the entire sector. I mean, you've got close to $200 billion in bad loans in the Italian banking sector alone. Have already soured. You're not talking about what goes from here. So, reflecting on the Brexit issue and just wrapping up, the central bankers have been given carte blanche to apply theoretical models that have never before been tested in the real world. And I go back to this sense of discontent around the world with the elites in every culture. And I want to end with a quote from a Bloomberg article that I read this week, and just see if what they say might reflect what's going on with this Brexit vote? What's going on with the rise of the five-star political party in Italy, which has just upset the Rome mayoral votes? You've got the nationalist French party, which is led by Le Pen. You've got Trump here in the United States. Ponder this as a sociological exercise.
So, Dave, what you're saying is I'm pondering the out-of-touch nature of the elite system at this point.
And it comes at a very awkward time because we're at the end of a credit cycle where a rise in nationalism is a natural effect.
Right. They're not providing bread and circuses anymore, and that's the problem. Where are the circuses? Where's the bread? Now let's go ahead and make a decision.
So here's what the Bloomberg commentary had to say. Over the last half century, Western elites managed to convince themselves that nationalism was not real. Perhaps it has been real in the past, like cholera and telegraph machines, but now that we are smarter and more modern, it would be forgotten in the due course of time as better ideas supplanted it. That now seems hopelessly naive. People do care more about people who are like them, who speak their language, eat their food, share their customs and values. And when elites try to ignore those sentiments or banish them by declaring that they are simply racist, this doesn't make the sentiments go away. It makes the non-elites suspect the elites of disloyalty. The rest of the population is outraged that the elites running things feel no greater moral obligation to their fellow countrymen than they do to some random stranger in another country. That's what you get to ponder as your weekly sociological exercise.
You've been listening to the McAlvany Weekly Commentary. I'm Kevin Orrick along with David McAlvany. You can find us at McAlvany.com. That's McAlvany.com. Or give us a call at 800-525-9556.
This has been the McAlvany Weekly Commentary. The views expressed should not be considered to be a solicitation or a recommendation for your investment portfolio. You should consult a professional financial advisor to assess your suitability for risk and investment. Join us again next week for a new edition of the McAlvany Weekly Commentary.